I can't marry her, but I'll always protect the woman I truly love. Ryan Carter typed those 9 words beneath a photo of another woman asleep in his car and posted it to the world 30 days before his wedding, while his bride stood 20 feet away holding champagne meant to celebrate them. He smiled as he did it. He didn't hide it. And across the room, Emma Whitmore read every word, looked up at the man whose entire empire she had built with her own hands, and did the one thing that should have terrified him. She smiled back. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you believe a woman should never have to shrink herself to make a man feel tall, then take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this story turns in ways you will not see coming. And do me a favor. Comment the name of the city where you're watching from so I can see just how far Emma's story has traveled. Now let's begin. Emma Whitmore did not scream when she saw that post. That is the first thing you need to understand about her. She was standing near the tall windows of the restaurant her own money had helped make famous, and her thumb had drifted across her phone, the way anyone's thumb drifts when they're tired and happy and a little bored. She wasn't looking for anything. She had spent the whole evening thanking guests, adjusting seating cards, whispering to the caterer about which investors were vegetarian. She was working even at her own party because that was who she was. And then she saw the photo, and then she saw the caption, and the world went very, very quiet. The young woman in this picture was Lily Parker. Emma knew her. Emma had hired her. 3 months earlier, Emma had sat across a conference table and looked at that soft, uncertain young face and thought she needs a chance. Emma had signed the offer letter herself. She had told Ryan, "There's something sweet about her. Let's bring her in." And Ryan had smiled and said, "Whatever you think, love, you always know." You always know. Those 3 words rang in her ears now like a bell in an empty church. Emma stood there and let the noise of the party wash back in around her, the clink of glasses, the low music, someone laughing too loudly near the bar. She looked up slowly and found Ryan across the room. He was laughing with 2 investors, one hand resting easy in his pocket, his jaw catching the light, the way it always did in the photographs the magazines loved to run. Wall Street's rising star, that's what they called him. Emma had watched them build that phrase. She had written half the pitch decks that put it in their mouths. And in that moment she understood something that no amount of crying would have taught her. Ryan had not chosen Lily because Lily was more beautiful. He had not chosen her because she was smarter or kinder or more loyal. He had chosen her because Lily looked up at him, because Lily made him feel enormous, because next to Emma, who ran the numbers and closed the deals and caught the mistakes before they cost him millions, Ryan had started to feel small, and next to Lily, who asked him wide-eyed how he understood the market so well, he felt like a god. Emma set her champagne down on the windowsill without drinking it. She did not walk over to him. She did not throw the glass. She did the one thing that would have terrified him if he'd been paying attention. She smiled. A small, calm, private smile. And then she picked her purse up off the chair and she went home. Ryan didn't even notice she had left. He texted her at 11:40 that night. "Where'd you disappear to, superstar? You missed the toast, LOL." Emma read that message sitting alone at her kitchen table and she almost laughed. Superstar. He'd been calling her that for years, and she'd always taken it as affection. Now she heard it for what it was, a leash with a rhinestone on it. A word that sounded like a compliment and worked like a cage. She typed back a single word. Tired. Then she put the phone face down and sat in the dark, and she began to think. Not the frantic spinning thoughts of a woman who had just been betrayed. Something colder and clearer than that. She began to add things up. 7 years, 2 companies, 1 house with both their names on the deed. Investor relationships she had personally nurtured over hundreds of dinners. A reputation she had polished until it shone. And underneath all of it, one simple, brutal question she had never allowed herself to ask before tonight. What exactly had Ryan built without her? She sat with that question until 3 in the morning, and the answer was so small it fit in the palm of her hand. The next day, Emma did not confront him. She had decided something in the dark. Confrontation was a door that let the other person prepare. Silence was a room where you could watch them be themselves. So she went to work and she watched. She watched Ryan walk into the 10 o'clock meeting and stop at Lily's desk. She watched him set a coffee cup down in front of the young woman without a word, and she watched Lily light up like a window at dawn. Oat milk extra shot, a little cinnamon. Emma knew that because Emma had heard Lily mention it once in passing weeks ago. Ryan had remembered. Ryan, who had asked Emma 3 separate times over 7 years how she took her coffee and never once got it right. Emma filed that away without a flicker on her face. In the meeting, she presented the numbers on the Hartwell deal, the biggest investment their firm had ever pursued, the one she had been working 18-hour days to close. She laid it out clean and sharp, the risk models, the exit strategy, the timeline. When she finished, there was a pause, and then Ryan turned to Lily and said, "Lily, you had a thought earlier about the branding side. Go ahead, share it. It was great." Lily flushed and stammered out an idea about making the pitch feel warmer. And Ryan nodded like she'd just cured a disease. "See, that's exactly the kind of fresh thinking we need in this room," he said. And Emma sat there with a fully modeled $100 million deal in front of her and understood that she had just been made invisible in the company she'd co-founded. After the meeting, she caught Ryan in the hallway. She kept her voice level. "I've been at the office until 2 a.m, 3 nights running," she said. "The Hartwell numbers are tighter than anything we've ever brought to a table. I'd appreciate it if we could talk about the actual deal instead of the branding warmth." And Ryan. God, this is the part she would remember. Ryan sighed. He looked at her with something almost like pity. "Emma," he said, "you're always so intense, so serious. It's exhausting sometimes, you know that. Maybe you could learn to relax a little, be more like Lily." Be more like Lily. Emma felt something inside her go very still. It was not the stillness of a woman about to break. It was the stillness of ice, thickening on a lake, the kind you could walk across in a week. "You're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I should." Ryan smiled, relieved, thinking he'd won something. He had no idea he'd just lost everything. He patted her shoulder and walked off whistling. That night, Emma sat in her home office and did what she did best. She organized information. She was not building a weapon yet. She was simply looking the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, refusing to flinch. She pulled up the shared company drives. She reviewed the trust documents Ryan had been pushing her to sign for the past 2 weeks, the ones his mother Victoria had been so gently insistent about. "It's just to protect the family's future, dear," Victoria had said, patting Emma's hand at Sunday dinner. "You understand. You're practically family already." Practically. Even that word had a hook in it. Emma read the trust paperwork line by line, the way she should have read it the first time, when she'd been too in love and too tired to look. And what she found made her put the papers down and walk to the window and stand there for a long time. The trust did not protect the family's future. The trust moved several of the company's most valuable assets that existed because of Emma's work, Emma's relationships, Emma's sleepless nights into a structure that quietly funneled control to Ryan's younger brother Daniel. Daniel, who was 34 years old and had never held a job for longer than a season. Daniel, who was finding himself in Aspen last Emma had heard. If she signed those papers, she would be handing years of her life to a man who had never earned a dollar he didn't borrow. Emma stood very still and let the last illusion die. Ryan hadn't just fallen for another woman, that she could have almost survived. Hearts wandered, people failed. But this was colder. This was a plan. Ryan and his family had looked at Emma, brilliant, driven, generous Emma, and they had not seen a partner. They had seen an asset. A revenue stream with a pretty face. A woman successful enough to fund their comfort and soft enough to sign whatever was slid across the table with a smile. For 7 years, she had believed she was building a life with a man she loved. She had actually been running a charity for a family that despised her strength. Something happened to Emma in that moment that is hard to describe. It was not rage. Rage burns hot and burns out. This was different. This was clarity. And clarity is patient. She turned away from the window, sat back down, and for the first time all week, she felt completely calm. "Okay," she said aloud to the empty room. "Okay." She opened the wedding planner sitting on the corner of her desk. Ivory cover, gold lettering, $400, chosen by Victoria. Inside were tabs for the venue, the florals, the guest list, the seating chart, the 11-piece string ensemble Ryan had insisted on because investors remember a good show. Emma ran her finger down the tabs, and then very calmly she picked up her phone and made the first call. "Hi, this is Emma Whitmore. I'm calling about the reservation for the 28th. A pause. "Yes, I need to cancel it." Another pause. "I understand there's no refund. That's fine. Cancel it." She hung up. She did not feel triumphant. She felt like a surgeon making the first clean incision. The second call was to the bank. She had built the financial structure of both companies herself, which meant she knew exactly where every account lived and exactly which ones she was a signatory on. She began quietly and legally to freeze what needed freezing and separate what needed separating. She was not stealing. She was not sabotaging. She was doing something far more devastating. She was withdrawing. For 7 years, Emma had been the reason things didn't fall apart the safety net under every reckless move Ryan made, the one who caught the errors smoothed. The investors kept the whole beautiful machine running. She was not going to burn his house down. She was simply going to stop being the foundation it stood on. Over the next several days, Emma moved with a precision that would have frightened Ryan if he'd been capable of noticing anything beyond his own reflection. She quietly reached out to 3 of the firm's largest investors, people who had trusted her personally for years, who had signed on because of dinners in her home and phone calls she'd taken at midnight. She didn't say a word against Ryan. She didn't have to. She simply let them know, in the gentlest possible terms, that her role in the firm might be changing and that she wanted to make sure their interests stayed protected. Every one of them said the same thing in one form or another. "Emma, honestly, we invested in you, not him." She thanked them. She hung up, and she added their words to the growing pile of evidence that the entire empire had always rested on her shoulders, not his. Meanwhile, Ryan noticed nothing. This is the part that still amazes people when they hear the story. A woman was dismantling his entire world, one careful thread at a time, right under his nose, and he was too busy admiring himself to see it. He came home 3 nights that week glowing about how well things were going. "The Hartwell people love us," he announced one evening, dropping onto the couch. "I think we've got them." "Do you?" Emma said. I really turned on the charm today." He grinned. "You should have seen me." "I'm sure it was something," she said. He didn't hear the ice in it. He never heard anything he didn't want to hear. It was on the 4th night that Emma made a discovery that changed the shape of everything. She had been going through the company's communication records she had every right to. Her name was on the incorporation documents, and she found a thread of messages between Ryan and one of the Hartwell representatives. And in that thread, Ryan had made promises. Specific promises, numbers he had guaranteed, returns he had projected, figures that Emma, who actually understood the math, knew were not just optimistic. They were false. Ryan had lied to the investors to close the deal, banking on Emma to somehow make the impossible numbers real after the ink dried the way she always had. Emma read that thread twice, and she realized she was holding something far larger than a cheating fiancé and a greedy family. She was holding proof that the golden boy of Wall Street was a fraud who had only ever been solvent because a woman he was about to betray kept quietly cleaning up behind him. She did not gasp. She did not call anyone. She simply saved everything. Screenshots, documents, the trust papers, the investor messages, the photo of Lily and its 9-word caption. She organized it all the way she organized everything clean, dated, undeniable. She built a file that told a complete story beginning to end, and she told no one it existed, because Emma had learned something in 7 years of standing behind Ryan Carter. She had learned that the loudest revenge is the weakest, that anyone can scream, that anyone can throw a glass, send a furious text cry at a party, and make a scene the guests would whisper about for a week. That kind of revenge feels good for an hour and changes nothing. Emma didn't want to feel good for an hour. She wanted the truth to walk into a room by itself in front of every person whose opinion Ryan had ever spent his life chasing and take everything from him without her having to raise her voice. She just needed the right room. And there was one already on the calendar, One perfect ready-made room with a stage with giant screens with 300 guests, including every investor Ryan had ever wanted to impress. A room Ryan himself had insisted on because he wanted a show. The wedding. Emma closed the ivory planner, and for the first time in a week, she slept through the night. The days that followed were surreal in their calm. Ryan, believing the wedding was still on, threw himself into the performance of it. He called his mother twice a day. He drafted a speech he wanted to give to the investors at the reception when everyone's got a drink in them and the mood is right. He even bragged to a colleague within Emma's hearing that marrying Emma was the smartest business move of his life. Emma heard that from the next room, and she wrote it down too. Once and only once Ryan came close to seeing her. It was late, and he found her at her desk, the glow of the screen on her face. "You've been quiet," he said. "Not concerned. Just observing the way you'd notice a thermostat clicking off." Emma looked up at him, and for a strange suspended moment she almost felt something like grief, not for the man in front of her, but for the man she'd believed he was for 7 years. A ghost she'd been in love with. A person who had never actually existed. "I've had a lot to think about," she said. "Cold feet." He smirked. "Little late for that superstar." "No," she said softly. "My feet have never been warmer." He laughed, misunderstanding entirely, and kissed the top of her head and told her to get some sleep. She listened to him walk down the hall, whistling again, so sure of a future that no longer existed. And she thought, "You have no idea what's coming, and that is exactly what you deserve." But here is the thing about Emma Whitmore that Ryan never understood, and that his mother Victoria never understood, and that Lily Parker, poor foolish Lily, would only understand far too late. Emma was not doing any of this for revenge. If it had only been about revenge, she would have been just another wounded woman. Getting even and getting even keeps you tied to the person who hurt you. It keeps them at the center of your story. Emma had spent 7 years with Ryan Carter at the center of her story, and she was done. What she was building in those quiet nights was not a weapon aimed at him. It was a door out. The evidence, the frozen accounts the investor calls the canceled venue, those were not about destroying Ryan. Those were about making absolutely permanently sure that when she walked out whole. With her name, with her worth, with her future intact and his hands nowhere near it. The destruction of Ryan Carter would simply be what happened when you removed the woman who'd been holding him up. Still, and Emma would admit this only to herself, late at night there was one piece of the plan that was not strictly necessary, one flourish that went beyond protecting herself, and it was the wedding. She could have simply canceled, walked away, filed the paperwork, and vanished into her new life. But she had decided somewhere in the cold clarity of that first sleepless night that Ryan Carter had spent 7 years performing a version of himself for a crowd. He had lied to that crowd. He had used her to impress that crowd. He had made her small in front of that crowd, so the crowd would see him one last time, as he truly was. There was only one problem with Emma's plan, and it was a large one. A plan like this, walking away from a shared empire, protecting your assets, exposing a fraud, rebuilding a life from the ground up in a matter of weeks, a plan like that was almost impossible to execute alone. Emma was brilliant, but she was one woman, and Ryan and his family had lawyers' connections and a head start of 7 years inside her life. To do this cleanly, to do it in a way that left her not just free, but stronger than before, she was going to need something she had never once asked for in her entire life. She was going to need a partner, a real one. And as she sat at her desk at 2 a.m, staring at the file she'd built, one name surfaced in her mind. A name from years ago, a man she'd met at a conference and dismissed because she'd been too in love with Ryan to hear what he was telling her. A man who had looked at her across a crowded ballroom, young underestimated, standing quietly behind her famous fiancé, and said something she had never been able to fully forget. "The most dangerous person in any room," he'd told her, "is the one everyone underestimates." At the time, she'd thought he was flirting. She'd smiled politely and gone back to Ryan. Now, 7 years later, she understood he'd been giving her a mirror. Emma picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. It was 2 a.m. Any sane person would wait until a decent hour. But Emma had stopped living by other people's clocks the moment she saw that photo. She found his name, Alexander Reed. She hadn't spoken to him in years. She had no idea if the number still worked. No idea if he'd remember her. No idea if the man who ran one of the largest private investment firms in America would even take a call from a woman whose whole world was quietly coming apart. She pressed the button anyway. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and on the 4th ring a voice answered awake, unhurried, as if 2 in the morning were simply another hour to him. "This is Alexander." Emma took a breath, and in that breath was everything 7 years, 1 photograph, 9 cruel words, a frozen bank account, a canceled wedding venue, a family that saw her as an asset, and a man across town sleeping soundly, certain he had won. "Alexander," she said, and her voice did not shake. "It's Emma Whitmore. You probably don't remember me. We met years ago. You said something to me once, and I've been thinking about it lately." A pause. A small, steady smile that he could not see, but somehow on the other end of the line seemed to feel. "You said the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates." There was a silence, and then quietly, Alexander Reed laughed, not unkindly, a low, warm, interested laugh, the laugh of a man who had just realized his evening was about to become far more interesting. "Emma Whitmore," he said, "I remember you perfectly. I've wondered more than once when you'd finally figure out I was talking about you." Emma closed her eyes. Something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 7 long years finally quietly let go. "I figured it out," she said, "and I have a proposal for you. I think you're going to want to hear it." "I'm listening," said Alexander Reed. And across the sleeping city, in a house that still had 2 names on the deed, in a life that Emma Whitmore was about to walk out of forever, the woman everyone had underestimated began at last to speak. Alexander Reed listened to Emma talk for 40 minutes without interrupting once, and when she finished laying out everything, the photo, the trust, the false promises to the Hartwell investors, the family that had spent 7 years treating her like a bank account with a heartbeat, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said the words that would change the direction of her entire life. "Emma," he said quietly, "I've been in this business 20 years. I've watched 100 people try to burn down someone who wronged them. You know what they all had in common?" He didn't wait for her to answer. They lost, every single one of them. Because the second revenge becomes the goal you've handed the other person the wheel. You're not driving anymore. He is. A beat. "You didn't call me for revenge." I could hear it in the first sentence. "You called me because you want out, and you want to walk out standing taller than you walked in. That I can help with. That I'd be honored to help with." Emma sat very still at her desk. It was almost 3 in the morning now, and for the first time in 7 years, someone had understood exactly what she meant without her having to shrink it, soften it, or explain it 3 times. "So you'll help me," she said. "I'll do better than help," Alexander said. "I'll partner with you, properly, and I have an idea I want you to sit with before you say no." Another pause, and she could almost hear him choosing his words like a man laying stones across a river. "Come to my office tomorrow. Not as a favor, as a business meeting. I think there's a way to do this that protects everything you've built, secures your company's shares permanently, and makes it impossible, legally, structurally impossible for Ryan or his mother to ever touch you again. But it's unconventional. And I don't want to say it over the phone at 3 in the morning when you're exhausted." "I'm not exhausted," Emma said. Alexander laughed softly. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are. 10 o'clock. I'll send a car." She hung up and she sat in the dark, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, something sturdier than hope. She felt like a person again instead of a resource. The next morning Ryan noticed nothing, which by now was almost funny. He came into the kitchen at 8, phone in hand, scrolling, humming, and he said, "You're up early." He didn't look at her when he said it. "I have a meeting," Emma said. With who?" And here was the moment. She could have lied smoothly. Instead, she chose a truth so casual it disappeared. "A potential investor," she said, "for the firm." Ryan's head came up at that. Money was the one word that could always find his attention. "Oh, yeah, anyone I know." "Not yet," Emma said, and she picked up her bag and walked out before he could ask another question, and she felt his eyes on her back the whole way to the door, curious for the first time in weeks, and too late. Alexander Reed's office occupied the top 3 floors of a building that Emma had walked past 100 times without ever going inside. His assistant brought her coffee, and it was correct black with 1 sugar, which she noticed, and which told her Alexander had asked, which told her something else entirely. Alexander himself came out from behind his desk to greet her, and he did not do the thing men in his position always did, the thing Ryan did, constantly. The little dominance games, the too firm handshake, the seat position to make you look up at them. He simply pulled out a chair for her at a table by the window, sat down across from her as an equal, and said, "Show me the file." She showed him the file. He went through it slowly, page by page, his face giving away nothing. When he reached the Hartwell messages, the promises Ryan had made, the numbers that were not just wrong, but fabricated, Alexander stopped. He read them twice. Then he set the papers down and looked at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked. "A cheating fiancé," she said. "A greedy family, a fraud." "No," Alexander said. "I mean legally. Emma, these aren't just lies to a girlfriend. These are material misrepresentations to investors. This is the kind of thing that ends careers, that triggers investigations, that in the wrong light is a crime." He leaned forward. "You've been sitting on a bomb and treating it like a diary." Emma absorbed that. "I didn't build the file to blow anyone up," she said. "I built it to protect myself, so that when I walked away, no one could ever say I stole or lied or sabotaged. Everything I did clean. I wanted the record to be clean." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his face. Respect, but deeper than that. "You built a defense," he said slowly, "when 99 people out of 100 would have built a weapon." "A weapon ties you to the person you hit," Emma said. "I don't want to be tied to him anymore, in any direction. Not love, not hate. I want him out of my story completely." And that right there was the moment Alexander Reed stopped seeing Emma Whitmore as a woman who'd been wronged and started seeing her as the most impressive person who'd walked into his office in a decade. "All right," he said. "Then here's my proposal, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." He folded his hands. "You're about to walk away from a shared company, a shared home, and a fiancé who has structured his entire financial life around the assumption that your assets are his to move. Legally, you're strong, but you're exposed. It'll take months of litigation to fully separate, and during those months, he and his mother will do everything they can to freeze you, smear you, and drain you. That's the reality." "I know," Emma said. "I've run the timeline." "Of course you have." A ghost of a smile. "So here's how we shortcut all of it. A strategic marriage between the two of us." Emma did not move. "Not romance," Alexander said quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm not that man, and this isn't that offer. I mean a legal and financial partnership formalized as a marriage. The moment you're married to me, your assets fall under a structure my firm has spent 20 years perfecting. Your company's shares become untouchable. Ryan's trust maneuver becomes legally impossible overnight. His investors, the ones who already trust you more than him, get a signal that you've aligned with one of the most powerful firms in the country, and they follow you out the door. You don't spend a year in court bleeding money. You walk away in 30 days whole, protected, and stronger than you've ever been. And I get," he paused, "the privilege of having the most underestimated mind in this city sitting on my side of the table." The room was very quiet. Emma looked at him, and she asked the only question that mattered. "Why would you do this? What do you actually get, Alexander? Be honest with me, because I've spent 7 years with a man who was never once honest about what he wanted from me, and I will not do that again. Ever." Alexander was quiet for a moment, and then he did something Ryan had never done in 7 years. He told her the truth. "Because I've watched brilliant women get chewed up by men like Ryan Carter my entire career," he said. "My mother was one of them. She built my father's company. He put his name on it and her in the ground, worked half to death, credited for nothing. I was 12 when she died, and I watched him give a eulogy about how he'd built everything himself." His jaw tightened. "So, when a woman like you calls me at 3 a.m, having built an empire for a man who's about to hand it to his failure of a brother, and she doesn't ask me to save her, She asks me to partner with her." He stopped. "Let's just say this is the one kind of business I never say no to, and yes, I'll benefit. Your mind on my team is worth more than any fee I could charge. This isn't charity, Emma. It's the best deal I've been offered in years. I just happen to also believe in it." Emma sat with that. She realized, the most honest thing a man had said to her in a decade. "I need to think," she said. "You'd be a fool not to," Alexander said. "Take the day, take the week. But Emma," and here his voice gentled, "don't take longer than the wedding. Whatever you're planning for that day, and I can see there's something in your eyes, do it as a woman who's already free, not as a woman still trying to get free. There's a difference, and everyone in that room will feel it." She left his office at noon, and she walked 20 blocks in the cold without noticing the distance, turning it over and over. And by the time she reached her own front door, she had decided she would say yes, not because she needed rescuing. She wanted that on the record in her own heart forever. She was not a woman being saved. She was a woman choosing a partner, the first real one she'd ever had, the way you choose an ally before a war you fully intend to win. Alexander wasn't her lifeboat. He was another commander who'd recognized a fellow commander across a battlefield and offered to fight on the same side. That evening, Ryan was in an expansive mood. He'd had a good day. The Hartwell people had confirmed a meeting. He poured himself a scotch and dropped onto the couch and said, "So, how'd your little investor meeting go?" Emma set down her bag. "It went well," she said. "Very well, actually." "Yeah, They're extremely interested," she said. "It looks like it's going to be a long-term partnership." Ryan raised his glass in a lazy toast, not even looking at her, having already lost interest, now that there was no immediate check to cash. "That's my girl," he said, "always closing." And he turned back to his phone. Emma stood there and looked at the back of his head, and she thought about how many times she had heard those words, "That's my girl, always closing," and taken them as love. She understood now that they had never once been about her. They were about what she produced. She was a machine he was proud of owning, and in 3 weeks the machine was going to walk itself out of the factory and take every part with it. The days that followed moved fast, and Emma moved faster. She and Alexander met every morning at 7 before the business day began, in a small conference room his firm kept for sensitive matters. They worked with a precision that frankly thrilled her, because for the first time in her professional life, she was working with someone who never needed a thing explained twice. The legal team drafted the marriage partnership structure. The financial team modeled the asset transfer. Emma personally handled the investors because those were her relationships built over years of trust, and she was not about to hand them to a lawyer. It was on the 5th morning that the first thing went wrong. Emma was reviewing the trust documents one final time before her attorney formally rejected them when she noticed something she'd missed. A clause buried deep in language deliberately dense. She read it 3 times, and her blood went cold. The trust wasn't waiting for her signature. It had a provision, a monstrous predatory provision, that stated the asset transfer would execute automatically upon the union of the parties in marriage. In other words, the moment Emma married Ryan, the assets would move to the trust to Daniel without a single additional signature. Victoria had built a machine that would rob Emma at the altar. The wedding itself was the trigger. Emma had been about to walk down an aisle, and in the act of saying "I do" sign away years of her life without even knowing it. Emma called Alexander immediately. Her hand, she noticed with some distant surprise, was shaking. Not with fear, with fury. "They weren't going to trick me into signing," she said. "They were going to marry me into it. The wedding was the theft, the whole thing. The dress, the venue, the string quartet. It was a heist with flowers." Alexander was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very careful. "Emma, do you understand what this means?" "It means I almost lost everything." "It means more than that," he said. "It means Ryan and his mother didn't fall into this. They planned it. The photo of the girl, the emotional distance, the way they've been treating you, some of that might be real. But the trust, the timing, the automatic trigger. Emma, this is months of legal work. This was designed. They needed you, calm and unsuspecting, right up until the ceremony. They needed you to still be in love, or at least still hoping on your wedding day, because a heartbroken bride might cancel. A hopeful one walks down the aisle. And there it was, The twist Emma had not seen. She had believed she was the one watching, the one gathering evidence, the one 3 moves ahead. And she had been, but so had they. The betrayal wasn't a man losing his heart to a younger woman. That was the cover story. The betrayal was a family that had been quietly building a trap for months and had needed her to keep believing in the fairy tale just long enough to spring it. Emma sat down slowly. "The photo," she said, "the post about Lily, that wasn't him being careless. That was a mistake. He wasn't supposed to let me see that. It nearly blew the whole thing up." "Almost certainly," Alexander said. "You said he posted it publicly and then acted like nothing happened. A man executing a careful long con doesn't advertise his affair 30 days before the payday unless he's arrogant enough to think he can have both," Emma finished. "The money and the girl. Unless he thought I'd never look. Or if I did, I'd forgive him like I always have and marry him anyway, and he'd walk away with everything and Lily on the side." Her voice had gone flat and terrible. "He didn't just want to use me. He wanted to humiliate me while he did it. He wanted me to know on some level and marry him anyway, because that would prove I had no choice. That's the part he wanted, not the money, the proof that I'd stay." The line was quiet. "Emma," Alexander said gently, "you need to hear me now. This changes our timeline. If the wedding is the trigger, then every single thing has to be finalized before that day, not after. The marriage between you and me, the asset protection, the share transfer, all of it has to be legally complete and airtight before you ever set foot near that ballroom. Because if there's a single gap, a single hour, where you're technically still bound to that trust structure, they will find it." "Then we move faster," Emma said. "We move like the building's on fire," Alexander said, "because it is." They moved. What happened over the next 2 weeks was the most intense professional experience of Emma Whitmore's life, and she had built 2 companies. She and Alexander and a team of lawyers who signed non-disclosure agreements thicker than novels worked in a kind of controlled fury. They quietly dissolved Emma's legal entanglements with Ryan one by one. They restructured her company shares into a holding entity that Ryan's trust could not reach. They prepared the marriage documents. And through all of it, Emma continued to go home every night to the house she shared with Ryan and perform the role of the calm, distracted, slightly stressed bride-to-be, because the con only worked if the Marks believed it right up until the end. And now Emma was the one running the con. The strain of it was almost unbearable. There were nights she'd come home and Ryan would kiss her cheek and ask about the flowers, and she'd have to smile and answer, knowing what she knew, knowing what he and his mother had built to trap her, and she'd think, "I'm going to walk into that room in 14 days, and I am going to take everything, and you are going to smile at me right up until I do." One evening, about 10 days out, Victoria Carter came for dinner. She swept in with a gift for Emma, a delicate antique brooch, a family heirloom for my new daughter, and she pinned it to Emma's collar herself, her cold fingers brushing Emma's neck, and she said, "You've made my son so happy, dear. I hope you know how much this family values you." And she smiled a warm, maternal, poisonous smile. Emma smiled back. "I know exactly how much this family values me, Victoria," she said. "Believe me, I've done the math." Victoria's smile flickered just for a half second, some old predator instinct catching a note it couldn't quite place. Then it smoothed over. "Well," she said, "aren't you sweet?" And she went back to her wine, and she never knew. She genuinely never knew that the woman she'd just pinned an heirloom on had already dismantled her entire plan and was simply wearing the brooch out of a dark and private amusement. That was the night Emma understood something about herself. She was enjoying this, not the pain she would have given a great deal to have never learned any of it. But the game, the outmaneuvering, the quiet, devastating competence of it that she was good at. Better than any of them. She had spent 7 years using that gift to make Ryan look brilliant. It was strange and bracing to finally use it for herself. But the story was not finished twisting. 8 days before the wedding, Lily Parker came to Emma's office and closed the door. Emma looked up, and for a moment the 2 women simply regarded each other. The woman in the photograph and the woman who was supposed to be destroyed by it. Emma had expected if this moment ever came to feel rage. She didn't. She felt something closer to pity, and she was surprised by it. "I need to tell you something," Lily said. Her voice was shaking. "And I need you to not fire me until I finish." "Sit down, Lily," Emma said. Lily sat. Her hands were twisting in her lap. "That photo," she said. "The one Ryan posted. I didn't know he took it. I fell asleep in his car after a work event. I'd had 2 drinks I shouldn't have, and he offered to drive me home, and I fell asleep, and I woke up, and he was just watching me. And it scared me. And then a week later, that photo's on the internet with that caption, and everyone at the office is looking at me, and I—" Her voice broke. "I'm not his mistress, Emma. I swear to God. I'm 24. He's my boss. He kept telling me I was special, that I understood him, that you didn't appreciate him. And I was flattered. Okay, I was stupid and flattered. But the second I realized what he was actually doing, using me, using that photo to hurt you—" "Stop," Emma said quietly. Lily stopped. Emma looked at her for a long moment. And here was another twist, one that Emma had to sit inside for a beat before she could speak, because it rearranged something. Lily wasn't the other woman. Lily was another instrument. Ryan hadn't fallen for a younger woman at all. He'd found a young, impressionable employee and used her image, her flattery, her presence as a prop in the psychological game he was running on Emma. The affair Emma had believed in for 2 weeks, the affair that had cracked her heart open in front of that restaurant window, might never have been an affair at all. It might have been theater. Cruelty dressed up as passion staged to make Emma feel replaceable enough to stay quiet, small enough to sign. "Why are you telling me this?" Emma asked. Lily looked at her hands. "Because 2 days ago I overheard him on the phone with his mother," she said, "and they were talking about the wedding, and about a trust, and about how once it was done, Daniel would finally be taken care of. And they laughed, Emma. They laughed about you. And I realized I wasn't the girl he was leaving you for. I was a knife he was using, and I couldn't be a part of that. I couldn't." Emma was quiet for a long time. Then she walked around her desk, and did something that surprised them both. She put her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to come here. It cost you something to come here. I won't forget that." Lily looked up, tears streaking her face. "Are you going to marry him?" Emma smiled. And it was the same small, calm, private smile she'd worn at the restaurant window 3 weeks earlier, but it had changed. There was no pain in it now, only certainty. "No, Lily," she said. "I'm not going to marry him, but I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it exactly right. Can you do that?" Lily wiped her face, and something in Emma's calm seemed to steady her. "Yes," she said. "Tell me what you need." What Emma needed was simple. She needed Lily to keep going to work exactly as before, to smile at Ryan, to flatter him, to let him believe his little game was still working, that his instrument was still in his hand. Because now Emma had something even better than a file. She had a witness who had heard with her own ears Victoria and Ryan laughing about the trust. And Emma was going to need that witness in exactly 8 days. "You want me there," Lily said slowly. "At the wedding. I want you there," Emma said. "In the room, as a guest. And when the moment comes, and you'll know it when it comes, I want you to simply tell the truth. That's all. You won't have to accuse anyone. You won't have to perform. You'll just have to answer one question honestly in front of everyone." Emma held her gaze. "Can you tell the truth in a room full of powerful people, Lily? Knowing it'll end your career at that firm and start a much better one somewhere, I'll personally make sure you land." Lily stared at her, and then slowly something Emma recognized came into the young woman's face. The thing Emma had seen in her own reflection 3 weeks ago. The moment a person stops being small. "Yes," Lily said. "I can." "Good," said Emma. "Then go back to your desk, and Lily bring him his coffee tomorrow. Oat milk, extra shot cinnamon. Smile when you do it." Her eyes glinted. "Let him think he's winning right up until the second he isn't." Lily left the office, and Emma sat back down, and she picked up her phone and texted Alexander 3 words. "We have a witness." His reply came in seconds. "Then we don't just win. We make it undeniable. Are you ready for what this becomes?" Emma looked out at the office she'd built, the company she'd bled for the whole 7 years of her life that was about to end and begin again in a single afternoon. She typed back 1 word. "Yes." The final week was a strange, suspended thing. Emma existed in two worlds at once. In one, she was Ryan Carter's devoted bride, nodding through final fittings, approving the seating chart, letting Victoria fuss over the flowers. In the other, she was finalizing the legal machinery that would, in a matter of days, make her one of the most protected women in American business, and leave Ryan holding an empty bag with his name on it. Ryan, for his part, was flying high. He'd started talking about the wedding as if it were a business summit, which to him, Emma now understood, it always had been. "Everyone who matters is going to be in that room," he told her one night, pacing with excitement. "The Hartwell people, the whole investor group, my mother's connections. This is the day everything comes together, Emma. This is the day I arrive." He turned to her glowing, utterly sincere in his self-obsession. "You've been amazing through all this. You know that's solid as a rock. Not a single complaint." He kissed her forehead. "This is why I know we're going to be great. You just let me be great." "You just let me be great." Emma looked at him. Really looked at him, this man she'd loved for 7 years, this stranger who had been planning to rob her at the altar, while calling her solid as a rock, and she felt the very last thread of anything soft inside her snap clean. "You're right," she said. "The day everything comes together. I've been thinking about it constantly." "See?" Ryan beamed. "We're on the same page. We always have been. That's the secret superstar. That's why this works." "That's exactly why this works," Emma agreed. And she meant something so entirely different from what he heard that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. 3 days before the wedding, everything was finalized. Emma and Alexander were quietly and legally in the eyes of the state and the structure of the law partners. Her shares were sealed inside a fortress no trust could breach. Her investors had been personally briefed one by one and had to a person chosen her. The file was complete, time-stamped, and duplicated in 3 secure locations. Lily was in position. Everything was ready. There was only one thing left to do. That night, Emma sat alone in the home office one last time, in the house that would no longer be hers after the weekend, and she opened the ivory wedding planner with the gold lettering. She turned to the very back to a blank page, and she took out a pen. She wasn't writing vows. She was writing the running order for the presentation that would play on the giant screens above the stage, the screens Ryan had demanded for his big arrival. The messages, the financial documents, the trust with its monstrous automatic trigger clause, the Hartwell fraud, the photo and its 9 words, all of it sequenced with the same clean precision she'd brought to every pitch deck she'd ever built for a man who took the credit. Except this was the one presentation Ryan Carter would never get to take credit for. She finished the running order, closed the planner, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she pulled out her phone and looked at the last text from Alexander. It said simply, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow you stop being someone's asset and start being your own. I'll be there. Not to save you, to watch you." Emma read it twice. Then she turned off the light. Down the hall, she could hear Ryan on the phone with his mother laughing about something, his voice warm and confident, and utterly untroubled, the voice of a man who believed with his whole heart that in 72 hours he would walk into a ballroom full of the most powerful people he knew and finally, publicly become the great man he'd always pretended to be. He was half right. He was. In 72 hours, he would walk into that ballroom. Everyone who mattered would be watching, and the truth about who he really was would finally at last be revealed to every single person whose respect he had spent his whole life chasing. Emma closed her eyes in the dark, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt no fear about her wedding day. Only the deep, still patient calm of a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to find out. 2 days before the wedding at 9 in the morning, Ryan Carter's phone rang, and it was the first crack in a world he still believed was perfect. It was a man named Gerald Hartwell, the lead investor on the biggest deal of Ryan's life, and Gerald did not sound warm. "Ryan," he said, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. The return projections you sent us 3 weeks ago, the guaranteed floor, where did those numbers come from?" Ryan, standing in his kitchen in his robe, felt a small, cold finger touch the back of his neck. But he was Ryan Carter, and Ryan Carter had never met a question he couldn't charm. "Gerald, good morning. Those numbers came from our modeling team. They're rock solid. Why is there? Because I had my people run them independently, Gerald said. And they can't get anywhere near your floor. Not in any scenario, not even the optimistic ones. So either your modeling team is incompetent, or somebody handed us numbers that were never real. A pause that lasted a small eternity. Which is it, Ryan? And here is the thing, Ryan didn't know the thing that made that cold finger on his neck press a little harder. The reason Gerald Hartwell had suddenly 2 days before the wedding decided to independently verify numbers he'd accepted 3 weeks ago was Emma. Quietly, through a back channel, through a mutual contact she trusted completely, Emma had made sure a whisper reached Gerald's ear. Just a whisper, just enough to make a careful man check his math. She hadn't accused Ryan of anything. She'd simply removed the safety net that had always caught him herself and let his own lies float up to the surface on their own. "Gerald," Ryan said, and his voice had lost some of its music. "Let me pull Emma into this. She built the underlying models. She can walk your team through the assumptions." "I'd love to talk to Emma," Gerald said. "Frankly, Ryan, Emma's the only reason we came to the table in the first place. Have her call me." And he hung up. Ryan stood in his kitchen holding a dead phone, and for the first time in weeks, a small voice in the back of his mind said, "Something is wrong." He didn't listen to it. He never listened to it. He told himself Gerald was just being cautious, that Emma would smooth it over the way she always did, that everything would be fine after the wedding. He poured himself another coffee and pushed the cold feeling down. He should have listened. Emma got Gerald's call an hour later, and she handled it exactly as she'd planned. She was warm, professional, and utterly, devastatingly honest up to a very precise line. "Gerald," she said, "I want to be careful here because there are things I can't say yet for legal reasons. But I can tell you this. The models I built were sound. What was sent to you was not what I built. I would strongly encourage you to hold any final commitments until after this weekend. I think by Monday, a great deal is going to be much clearer." A pause. "And Gerald, whatever happens, my door is open to you, directly. That won't change." Gerald Hartwell was a man who'd spent 40 years reading between lines, and he heard everything Emma wasn't saying. "Emma," he said slowly, "are you all right?" "I'm better than I've been in 7 years," she said. "Watch this weekend, Gerald. And thank you for calling me directly. It tells me everything I needed to know about who you'd rather work with." She hung up, and she had in one phone call moved the single most important investor in the room from Ryan's column to her own without saying one false word. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander Reed was doing his part, and it was considerable. Because Emma's plan was elegant, but it was not simple, and there was a piece of it that terrified even her, a piece she'd only told Alexander about 3 days ago. The screens, the presentation, getting the evidence to play at the right moment on the giant screens at a venue controlled entirely by Ryan and Victoria, that was the one part of the plan with 100 ways to fail. The venue's tech would be run by Victoria's people. The AV feed would be locked down. If Emma simply tried to hijack it, someone would cut the power in 30 seconds and she'd be a hysterical bride making a scene exactly the story Ryan would want. "We can't fight their system," Alexander had said. "We have to own it before the day." And so quietly, Alexander's firm had done something that made Emma laugh out loud when he explained it. They had reached out to the venue, a luxury property that it turned out was carrying more debt than it wanted anyone to know, and Alexander's real estate arm had simply begun the process of acquiring it. Not the whole thing, not overnight, but enough. Enough that when the wedding coordinator needed a final favor, a small technical adjustment to the AV system for a surprise presentation the bride is planning for the groom, the venue's management was suddenly eagerly cooperative because the bride's new business partner was, as of yesterday, effectively their landlord. "You bought the building," Emma had said, stunned. "I bought leverage," Alexander corrected. "The building came with it. Emma, when you fight people like the Carters, you don't win by being louder. You win by owning the room they think they're standing in. Literally, if you have to." That was the moment Emma understood fully the scale of what she'd aligned herself with. And it was also the moment she understood something about Alexander Reed that unsettled her in a way she couldn't yet name. He was formidable. He was on her side. But a man who could quietly buy a building in 72 hours to win an argument was not a man you ever wanted to be on the wrong side of. She filed that thought away too. She was becoming, she realized, a woman who filed away a great many things. The day before the wedding, everything nearly came apart. Victoria Carter, who had not survived 61 years of high society, without instincts sharp as a razor, sensed something. She couldn't name it, but she'd caught the flicker in Emma's eyes at dinner, the odd calm, the too easy agreement. And Victoria, being Victoria, did not ignore her instincts. She made a call. To a private investigator she kept on retainer the way other women kept a hairdresser. "I want to know what Emma Whitmore has been doing for the last 3 weeks," she told him. "Every meeting, every phone call I can get. And I want it tonight." And this was the closest Emma's entire plan came to failure. Because if that investigator had started 24 hours earlier, he might have found the thread. He might have found Alexander, and the whole thing would have collapsed. But he started at 4 in the afternoon the day before the wedding, and Emma, careful, thorough, 3 moves ahead, Emma had spent 3 weeks being invisible for exactly this reason. Every meeting with Alexander had been off calendar. Every document had moved through channels no ordinary investigator could touch in a single evening. The car Alexander sent was never the same car twice. When the investigator called Victoria back at 11 that night, he had almost nothing. "She's been meeting with lawyers, which is normal before a wedding," he reported. "Some financial restructuring, which is also normal. Prenup work probably, nothing that jumps out." Victoria sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. The word prenup soothed her. Of course. Emma was just being careful with her money before the wedding. That was so very Emma, cautious to the last. Victoria smiled to herself, the last easy smile she would ever have, and she went to bed reassured, never knowing how close she'd come to catching the thing that was about to destroy her family. Emma, meanwhile, was not sleeping. She was sitting in a hotel suite Alexander had arranged because she had 2 nights before finally moved out of the house she shared with Ryan quietly, taking only what was hers, leaving everything that carried a memory she no longer wanted. Ryan hadn't even noticed. He'd been at his bachelor party, a lavish thing he'd thrown for himself, and he'd texted her at midnight. "Last night, as a free man, you ready to make me the luckiest guy alive tomorrow?" And Emma had looked at that message for a long time before typing back simply, "Tomorrow's going to change everything. Sleep well, Ryan." He'd sent back 3 heart emojis. She'd turned off her phone. Now in the hotel suite at 2 in the morning, there was a soft knock. It was Alexander. He'd come to go over the final sequence one last time, and Emma was grateful for it because the truth was that underneath all her calm, the enormity of what she was about to do had finally started to reach her. Tomorrow, she would end 7 years. She would detonate a man's entire life in front of 300 people. And even though he deserved it, even though he had planned to rob her at the altar, there was a part of Emma, the part that had loved him once, that had believed in the fairy tale that grieved. "You're allowed to feel it," Alexander said quietly, watching her face. "The grief. It doesn't make you weak. It means you actually loved him once. That's not a flaw, Emma. That's the thing that makes you nothing like them." Emma looked at him. "How do you know I'm grieving?" "Because I did it too," he said, "when I finally stood up to my father. The night before I took the company back from him legally, cleanly. The way you're doing this, I sat up all night grieving a man who never existed, the father I wished he'd been." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not grieving Ryan. You're grieving the 7 years. The girl who believed. Let her go gently. She got you here. She was never stupid, Emma. She was just loyal to someone who didn't deserve it. There's no shame in that." And something in Emma's chest, some knot she'd been carrying since the restaurant window 3 weeks ago, finally loosened. She looked at this man, this formidable, unsettling, unexpectedly gentle man, and she thought, I don't know what this is, this partnership, this arrangement. But I know it's the first time in 7 years someone has seen me clearly and not tried to make me smaller for it. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing it." "That's the whole deal," Emma, Alexander said, standing to leave. "That was always the whole deal. I don't need you to be less than you are. I need you to be exactly as much as you are. Tomorrow, 300 people are going to see exactly how much that is." He paused at the door. "Get some sleep. You have a wedding to attend." The morning of the wedding arrived, and Emma Whitmore woke up calm. It was strange she thought how calm she was. She had expected fear or rage or grief to be loudest today. Instead, there was only a deep, still readiness. She dressed slowly. Not in the wedding gown Victoria had chosen, that dress was still hanging in the bridal suite at the venue, and Emma had a different plan for it. She dressed in her own clothes, an elegant, simple dress she'd chosen herself in white, because she had decided that today she would wear white on her own terms, for her own reasons as a woman, marking the beginning of her real life. At 9 that morning, Lily texted her, "He's here early. He's practically vibrating. He keeps telling everyone this is the biggest day of his life." A pause, then a second message. "Emma, are you sure? Once this happens, there's no taking it back." Emma texted back. There was no taking it back the moment he posted that photo, Lily. We're just catching up to what he already did. Stay steady. You'll know your moment. At 10, the guests began to arrive at the venue, 300 of them. Investors, industry titans, Victoria's high society connections, the entire senior staff of the firm. Ryan had characteristically invited every powerful person he'd ever wanted to impress, because to Ryan, this was never a wedding. It was a coronation. He wanted witnesses to his ascension. He was going to get them. By 11, Emma was at the venue in a private room, watching everything unfold through the careful reports coming in from Lily and from Alexander's people who were positioned throughout the building. The AV system was theirs. The presentation was loaded. The evidence was sequenced. Alexander was in the crowd, seated quietly among the guests, unremarkable, unrecognized by anyone who mattered exactly as he preferred to be. The most dangerous person in the room, as he'd once said, is the one everyone underestimates. He'd built a career on being underestimated. Today, he was simply a well-dressed guest, watching the woman he'd bet everything on walk to the edge of the cliff, and instead of falling, learn that she'd had wings the whole time. At 11:45, Victoria came looking for Emma. She found her in the private room, and for a moment something crossed Victoria's face, that razor instinct again, catching something wrong in the picture. Emma wasn't in her gown. Emma was too calm. Emma was standing by the window in a white dress Victoria had never seen, with an expression Victoria couldn't read. "Emma, dear," Victoria said carefully. "Why aren't you dressed? The ceremony's in an hour. And what is that dress? Where's the gown?" Emma turned to look at her, and she smiled the small, calm smile that had unsettled Victoria at dinner 2 weeks ago. "Victoria," she said, "sit down for a moment. I want to talk to you mother to daughter, since we're about to be family." Victoria did not sit. Victoria's instincts were screaming now. "Emma, what's going on?" "I read the trust," Emma said simply. 4 words, and Victoria Carter's face, so practiced, so controlled, went absolutely white. "I read the trust," Emma said again gently, "including the clause that transfers everything the moment I say, 'I do.' The automatic trigger." "That was clever, Victoria. Truly. I've been in business a long time, and I've rarely seen anything that predatory dressed up so beautifully. A theft with flowers, a robbery at the altar. You built a machine that would rob me the moment I promised to love your son, and you pinned an heirloom on me and called me daughter while you did it." Victoria's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I'm not going to make a scene right now," Emma continued, her voice never rising. "You don't need to worry about that. In fact, I'd like you to go back out there and sit down and enjoy the ceremony. Because I promise you, Victoria, this is going to be a wedding that nobody in that room ever forgets." She stepped closer. "You spent months planning to take everything from me. I want you to have a front row seat while you learn how that feels." And then Emma Whitmore walked past a speechless, ashen Victoria Carter out of the private room and toward the ballroom where 300 of the most powerful people Ryan Carter knew were waiting for a wedding that was never, for one single second, going to be his. Behind her, Victoria finally found her voice, a strangled whisper. "What have you done?" Emma didn't turn around. "Nothing," she said. "Yet." The ballroom doors were closed. Behind them, Emma could hear the low murmur of 300 guests, the string ensemble Ryan had demanded, playing something soft and expensive. Somewhere in that room, Ryan Carter was standing near the stage, glowing, greeting investors, telling everyone this was the day everything came together. Somewhere in that room, Lily Parker was sitting quietly waiting for her moment, her hands folded, her heart pounding. somewhere in that room, Alexander Reed sat, unremarkable and unrecognized, watching the doors, waiting for the woman he'd bet on to walk through them. And somewhere behind Emma, Victoria Carter was fumbling for her phone with shaking hands, trying to call her son, trying to warn him. But it was already too late because Ryan had turned his phone off for the ceremony, wanting nothing to interrupt his big moment. Victoria's warning would go straight to voicemail. She would stand in that hallway powerless and listen to it ring and realize for the first time in her life that she had been outmaneuvered by the woman she'd underestimated. Emma stood before the closed ballroom doors. She took one breath. In her hand was a small remote given to her by Alexander's tech team connected to the giant screens above the stage. One button. That was all it would take. At exactly noon, the doors opened, and 300 faces turned to look at the bride. But Emma Whitmore did not walk down the aisle. She stopped just inside the doors, and she looked across the entire room at Ryan Carter, standing up there on the stage in his perfect suit, his face lighting up at the sight of her, already smiling, already lifting his hand in a small proud wave to his audience, already opening his mouth to say something charming. And Emma Whitmore raised the small remote in her hand, held his eyes across the length of that silent waiting room, and pressed the button. Emma pressed the button, and for one held breath, nothing happened. Just long enough for Ryan's smile to widen, for him to think this was part of some surprise she'd arranged for him, some romantic gesture from his devoted bride. Just long enough for 300 guests to follow his gaze up to the giant screens above the stage, expecting the sweet montage. Every wedding shows the childhood photos, the vacation snapshots, the story of a beautiful couple told in pictures. Then the screens came alive, and the montage was not sweet. The first thing that filled every screen in that ballroom, 12 feet tall, impossible to look away from, was a photograph. A young woman asleep in a car, and beneath it, in letters large enough to read from the very back row, 9 words. I can't be with her, but I'll always protect the woman I truly love. The murmur that went through the room was not loud. That was the terrible thing about it. It was a soft, collective intake of breath, 300 people leaning toward each other, 300 whispers starting at once. Emma watched it move across the crowd like wind across a field of wheat. On the stage, Ryan's smile did something strange. It froze, and then it began to slide off his face in pieces, the way a mask cracks. His hand still half raised, and that proud little wave drifted down. He looked up at the screen, at the photograph of Lily, asleep in his car, at his own words hanging there in the air he'd wanted to fill with applause, and for a moment he simply did not understand. His mind, so quick with charm, so slow with truth, could not assemble what it was seeing. What? He said, and the microphone near the stage caught it, carried the single confused syllable out across the silent room. What is this? Emma didn't answer him. She pressed the button again. The screen changed. Now it showed the trust. Not all of it Emma had chosen carefully, the way she chose everything. The relevant clause, the language magnified, highlighted, the automatic transfer, the trigger, the words upon the union of the parties in marriage glowing red where Alexander's team had marked them. And below the legal text in plain English that even the champagne-drinking guests could follow a single line of white text that Emma had written herself. This document transfers the bride's assets to the groom's family the moment she says, I do. She was never meant to read it. She read it. The whispers stopped being whispers. Somewhere in the third row, a man in an expensive suit said out loud, Jesus. Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped and put her hand over her mouth. And the investors were leaning forward now, all of them, because these were people who understood exactly what they were looking at. People who spoke the language of trusts and transfers fluently, people who could read that clause and know instantly that they were watching a robbery displayed in evidence. On the stage, Ryan finally found his feet. He lunged toward the edge of the platform, toward the AV table, where a technician sat frozen. Turn it off, he said. Turn it off right now, cut the feed. The technician looked at him and then looked toward the back of the room and did nothing, because the technician did not work for Ryan Carter anymore. The technician worked for the venue, and the venue, as of yesterday, answered to a very quiet man sitting in the fourth row who had made it exquisitely clear that the presentation was to run uninterrupted to the end. I said, turn it off. Ryan's voice cracked on the last word, and the microphone caught the crack, amplified it, sent the sound of his panic out across 300 people who had come to watch him be crowned and were now watching him unravel. Emma pressed the button again. The Hartwell documents came up. The messages, the guaranteed returns that were never real, the fabricated numbers laid side by side with the actual models, Emma's models, the honest ones, so that anyone could see the gap, the lie, the fraud. And Gerald Hartwell, sitting in the 5th row, went very still. Emma watched his face as he read his own correspondence on that 12-foot screen, as he saw in black and white exactly how he'd been deceived, exactly what he'd nearly signed. She watched 40 years of instinct settle into cold certainty in the lines of his face. He did not gasp. He did not whisper. He simply reached into his jacket, took out his phone, and began very calmly to type. Emma knew what he was doing. He was pulling his money right there, in real time, in the middle of the ceremony. And once Gerald moved, the others moved. That was the thing about a room full of investors. They watched each other more closely than they watched anything else. The moment one of them reached for his phone, a dozen more did the same. Emma stood by the doors and watched in the space of 90 seconds Ryan Carter's entire financial future evaporate through the glowing screens of 300 cell phones, each one carrying the same silent message down the same silent wires. Get out. Get out now, before it's public. Ryan didn't see it yet. He was still up on the stage, still trying to reach the AV feed, still shouting at a technician who wouldn't move. And he hadn't turned around, hadn't seen the phones, hadn't understood that while he was fighting the screens, the real damage was happening in every seat. Ryan! Emma's voice, when she finally spoke, was not loud. But the room had gone so silent that it carried anyway, and every head turned toward her. And Ryan froze. And slowly, he turned to look at his bride standing by the open doors in her own white dress, holding a small remote in her steady hand. "Emma," he said, and his voice had changed completely now. Gone was the charm, the music, the easy confidence of 7 years. What was left was something small and scrambling. "Emma, whatever you think this is, we can talk about this. Not here, please, not in front of everyone. Let me explain." "Explain what?" Emma asked. She took a step into the room. Just one. "Explain the photograph. Explain the trust. Explain the numbers you gave Gerald that were never real. Explain which part, Ryan, because I've had 3 weeks to read all of it, line by line. I've read your entire heart, and it turns out it fits on about 4 screens." A sound went through the crowd, not quite a laugh, something darker and more satisfied than a laugh. The sound of 300 people watching a powerful man be told the truth to his face and enjoying it more than they'd admit. Ryan's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, for anyone, for his mother. Where's Victoria, Mom?" He couldn't find her. She was still in the hallway, of course still frozen with a phone that would only ring and ring into her son's dead voicemail. "Someone find my mother," Ryan said, and the desperation in it was naked now, the golden boy calling for his mother in front of every person he'd ever wanted to impress. Emma took another step. "Your mother knows," she said quietly. "I told her 20 minutes ago. She's the one who built the trust, Ryan. Did you know that?" "Of course you knew that. You just didn't think I'd ever read it. You thought I'd walk down this aisle and say those 2 words and hand my whole life to your brother and never even know it happened. You thought I loved you enough to be blind. And the terrible thing," her voice caught just slightly, the only crack she would allow herself all day, "the terrible thing is that for 7 years I was." The room was so quiet now that Emma could hear the string ensemble's music still playing faintly, some machine in the corner still spinning out its soft, expensive melody absurdly over the wreckage. Someone finally had the sense to shut it off, and the sudden total silence was heavier than any sound. "You want to know the worst part?" Emma continued, and now she was looking only at Ryan, as if the 300 people had disappeared, as if it were just the 2 of them in the ruins of 7 years. "It wasn't the photo. I could have survived the photo. Hearts wander, people fail. I might even have forgiven you the photo, and God isn't that pathetic. That's exactly what you were counting on. No. The worst part was what you said to me. Do you remember?" You said I should be more like Lily. You said I was too serious, too intense, exhausting." She let the words land. "You spent 7 years standing on my shoulders, and then you looked down and told me my shoulders were too high." Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For once in his life, Ryan Carter had no charming answer, no smooth deflection, no words at all. "I built this," Emma said, and she gestured not at the screens, but at him, at his suit, at the whole gleaming image of the man he'd pretended to be. The reputation, the deals, the rising star of Wall Street. That was me. Every honest number, every saved relationship, every mistake I caught before it cost you everything. You are a story I wrote. And you were about to steal the pen and the ink and the paper and call yourself an author." She shook her head slowly. "I'm taking my story back, Ryan. All of it. Starting right now." It was then that Lily Parker stood up. She rose from her seat near the middle of the room, and every eye turned to her, and the young woman whose sleeping face was still faintly ghosted. On the darkened edge of one of the screens, stood there trembling but upright, and she looked at Ryan, and she said in a voice that shook and then steadied, "I heard you." Ryan's head snapped toward her. "Lily." "I heard you on the phone," Lily said louder now, finding her feet the way Emma had promised her she would. "2 days ago, talking to your mother, about the trust, about how once the wedding was done, Daniel would finally be taken care of. And you laughed. Both of you laughed, about her." She pointed at Emma, and her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "You used me. That photo, I didn't know you took it. I fell asleep in your car, and you photographed me like I was a thing you owned, and you put it on the internet to hurt her, and you told me I was special, and I believed you, and I am so ashamed." Tears were running down her face now, but her chin was up. "I'm not your mistress. I was your prop, and I won't be. Not anymore." The silence after Lily sat back down was the loudest thing in the room, because now it wasn't just evidence on a screen. Now there was a witness, a human voice, a young woman with tears on her face who had stood up in a room full of powerful strangers and told the truth at the cost of everything, and there is no document, no trust, no fabricated number that can compete with that. The room had turned. Emma could feel it turn, the way a tide turns all at once, and then all the way. Whatever sympathy anyone might have scraped together for Ryan Carter was gone now, drowned in the sound of a 24-year-old girl's shaking, honest voice. Ryan stood on his stage alone, above a room that now looked at him the way you look at something you've scraped off your shoe. "This is a setup," he said, and his voice had found a new register. Now an ugly one, the sound of a cornered man reaching for the only weapon he had left, which was accusation. "You planned this. All of it. You manipulated everyone in this room. You turned my own." He was pointing at Emma now, his finger shaking. "This is insane. This is a psychotic, calculated yes," Emma said simply. That one word stopped him cold. "Yes," she said again, calm as still water. "I planned all of it. Every screen, every document, Lily standing up, Gerald verifying his numbers. All of it. You're absolutely right, Ryan. I calculated every move." She smiled, and it was not a warm smile, but it was not a cruel one either. It was something worse for him than either. It was the smile of a woman who had finally completely stopped needing his approval. "You spent 7 years telling me I was too calculating, too strategic, too much. Well," she spread her hands, "here's all of me. Every bit of the woman you kept telling me to make smaller. This is what she can do when she stops apologizing for existing." She lowered her hands. "You should have wanted her, Ryan. She was the best thing you ever had. But you wanted someone who'd look up at you. So look up now. I'm all the way up here." And Ryan Carter looked up at the woman standing in the doorway, and something in his face finally fully collapsed because he understood 3 weeks too late, 7 years too late, that he had thrown away the one person who had ever truly been on his side, and that she was never, ever coming back. The investors were leaving now, not dramatically. That wasn't how these people operated. They simply began to rise one by one, and then, in groups gathering their coats, murmuring to one another, filing toward the doors, past Emma, and more than one of them paused as they passed her. Gerald Hartwell stopped in front of her, this weathered titan of a man, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "Monday, my office. We're going to talk about what your next company looks like. Because I'm investing in you, Emma. I always was. It just took me a little too long to see it clearly." And he squeezed her arm once and walked out. Another investor, a woman Emma had courted for years, paused and said only, "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen at a wedding," and pressed a card into Emma's hand and left. And another. And another. Ryan's coronation was emptying out guest by guest, and each departing figure was another brick pulled from the empire he'd thought he was about to complete, and by the time half the room had gone, there was no empire left at all. There was only a man on a stage in a beautiful suit in front of a shrinking crowd, with the photograph of his betrayal still glowing faintly above his head. Victoria finally made it into the room. She came through a side door, her phone still clutched in her white-knuckled hand, and she took one look at the screens, at the emptying seats, at her son standing frozen and ruined on the stage, and she understood everything in an instant. 61 years of instinct told her exactly what had happened here, and to whom and by whom. Her eyes found Emma across the wreckage, and the look on her face was pure distilled hatred, the hatred of a predator who has just discovered that the small, quiet thing she'd been circling was all along the larger predator. She crossed the room toward Emma fast, her heels sharp against the floor, and she stopped a foot away and hissed low enough that only Emma could hear, "You will regret this. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This family will bury you. I will make it my life's work to—" "Victoria!" Emma didn't step back. She didn't even blink. "Before you finish that sentence, I want you to understand something so you don't waste what's left of your life on a war you've already lost." She leaned in just slightly, and her voice was almost gentle. "Everything I've done in the last 3 weeks was legal. Every document, every transfer, every conversation. There is nothing to bury because I did nothing wrong. I simply stopped letting you rob me. You, on the other hand," she nodded toward the screens, "built a fraudulent trust designed to steal assets through deception. You're not the one who gets to make threats today, Victoria. You're the one who should be very, very glad that all I did was show these people the truth instead of showing it to the people who put families like yours in prison." Victoria's face went from white to gray. "So no," Emma continued softly, "you won't bury me. You'll go home, and you'll spend a long time trying to explain to what's left of your friends why your son's wedding became the most famous downfall this city has seen in a decade. And every time you try to tell your version, someone in the room will have seen the screens. That's your future, Victoria. I'm not going to touch you. I'm just going to let you live in the thing you built." She stepped back. "Enjoy the reception. I hear it's open bar." And Emma Whitmore turned away from Victoria Carter, from Ryan Carter, from 7 years of her life, and she walked back toward the open doors past the last of the departing guests, her head high, her steps, even her white dress catching the light. Behind her, the ballroom was nearly empty now. Ryan had sunk down onto the edge of the stage, his head in his hands, a man sitting in the rubble of a building he'd been so certain was a palace. Victoria stood frozen where Emma had left her, aging a decade in the span of a minute. Lily Parker was quietly gathering her things, and as she reached the aisle, she looked toward Emma, and Emma gave her the smallest nod, a nod that said, "You did it. You were brave. I've got you now." And Lily's tear-streaked face crumpled with relief. And at the very back of the room, one man had not left with the others. One man sat exactly where he'd been the entire time in the 4th row, unremarkable, unrecognized, watching the whole thing unfold with the quiet attention of a person who had seen many empires fall and had learned to appreciate a well-executed one. As Emma reached the door, she finally looked at him. Their eyes met across the ruined ballroom. Alexander Reed did not smile exactly, But he inclined his head very slightly, a gesture of pure respect one commander to another after a battle cleanly won. And then he rose from his seat, adjusted his jacket, and began to walk toward her unhurried through the wreckage past the frozen mother and the broken son, and not one of the few remaining guests had any idea who he was or that the quiet man crossing the room was the reason none of the screens had ever gone dark. He reached Emma at the doors. He offered her his arm, not to lead her, to stand beside her. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I was calculating," Emma said. "Too strategic. Too much." "Yes," Alexander agreed, and now he did smile just a little. "You were exactly the right amount of all of it." And Emma Whitmore took the arm of the man who had never once asked her to be smaller, and together they walked out of the ballroom where Ryan Carter's world had ended out into the rest of a life that was for the first time in 7 years entirely and completely her own. Behind them, in the silence of the emptied room, Ryan lifted his head from his hands. He looked at the doorway where his bride had just disappeared on another man's arm. He looked at the screen still faintly glowing with the evidence of everything he'd done. And Ryan Carter, the rising star of Wall Street, the golden boy who had everything and gambled it all to feel important, finally understood the one thing Emma had known for 3 weeks. He hadn't lost her because another man was better. He'd lost her because he believed she would always stay. The story of what happened in that ballroom did not stay in that ballroom. By 6 o'clock that evening, it had traveled through every group text and private message thread in the financial world, and by the following morning it was no longer a rumor at all. It was the thing everyone was talking about. 300 witnesses, and every one of them had a version, but the versions all agreed on the shape of it, the golden boy of Wall Street, exposed at his own wedding on giant screens by the woman he'd tried to rob at the altar. Someone had filmed part of it, of course. Someone always films. And by Monday, a clip of Lily Parker standing up in that crowded room and saying, "I heard you," with tears running down her face, had been shared so many times that people who had never met a single person involved were watching it on their phones on the subway and whispering to each other, "Did you see this? Did you see what she did?" Ryan Carter woke up Monday morning to a life that no longer existed. He had gone home Saturday night to the house he'd shared with Emma. The house he now discovered was almost entirely empty, because Emma had quietly moved her things out days before, and everything of value that had carried both their names had already legally been separated from him. He sat in the hollowed-out living room in the dark, waiting for his phone to fill with the usual noise of his life, the deals, the invitations, the people who wanted a piece of the rising star. His phone stayed silent, and then slowly it began to ring, and every single call was worse than the silence had been. The first was from the firm's largest institutional client withdrawing. The second was from Gerald Hartwell's office, a cold and formal message informing him that not only was the Hartwell deal dead, but that Mr. Hartwell's legal team was reviewing the fabricated projections for appropriate action. The third was from his own lawyer telling him in the careful voice lawyers use when they are already looking for the exit that they needed to have a very serious conversation about your exposure. Exposure. That was the word that finally made Ryan understand. It wasn't just that he'd been humiliated. It was that Emma, in showing the world the truth, had also shown the world the crimes. The fabricated numbers weren't just embarrassing. They were fraud, and fraud has consequences that no amount of charm can talk its way out of. Ryan did the only thing he could think to do. He called Emma. She was in Alexander's office when the call came, reviewing the first documents of her new venture, and she looked at Ryan's name on her screen for a long moment before she answered. She almost didn't, but something in her wanted to hear it, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to know finally whether there was anything left in him worth having grieved. "Emma," Ryan said, and his voice was wrecked raw, nothing like the smooth instrument she'd known for 7 years. "Emma, please, you've made your point. God, you've made your point. Everybody's made their point. I get it. I deserve it. Okay, I deserve all of it. But this is going too far. Hartwell's talking about lawyers. My own attorney's talking about Emma. They're using words like fraud. I could go to prison. Do you understand? You could actually put me in prison." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I didn't fabricate those numbers, Ryan," she said. "You did. I just stopped hiding them for you." You know I never meant it was a stretch. Okay, it was aggressive. Everybody stretches, that's the business. No, Emma said. Everybody doesn't. I never did. Not once in 7 years. That's the difference between us that you never understood. You thought I was cleaning up your messes because I loved you. I was cleaning them up because I have integrity, and I mistook your messes for the cost of loving someone. I was wrong about that. It was just the cost of enabling you. There was a long silence on the line, and then Ryan said the thing that told Emma finally and completely that there had never been anything left to grieve. If you had just loved me enough, he said, and there was bitterness in it now, self-pity curdling into blame. None of this would have happened if you'd been softer, if you'd let me be the man. You always had to be right, Emma. You always had to be the smartest one in the room. This is your fault, too. You made me feel like nothing, and a man can't live feeling like nothing. And Emma, who 3 weeks ago might have absorbed, that might have wondered if some part of it was true, might have carried it like a stone in her chest. Emma laughed, not cruelly, just a short, surprised, genuinely relieved laugh, because she recognized in that moment that the last thread connecting her to this man had finally dissolved. Ryan, she said almost kindly, I made you feel like nothing by being something. Sit with that. Sit with it for a long time because it's the truest thing you've ever said, and you don't even know it. She paused. I hope you get a good lawyer. I'm not going to pursue anything against you personally. I have no interest in it. I got everything I need, which is my freedom and my name. What Hartwell does is between you and Hartwell. That was always your choice, not mine. Goodbye, Ryan. Emma, wait. She hung up, and she set the phone down on the table, and she looked up, and Alexander was watching her from across the room, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet attention. You okay? He asked. I am, Emma said, and she was a little surprised to find that it was completely true. That was the last of it, the last little hook he had in me. He tried to tell me it was all my fault that I made him feel small by not being small myself. She shook her head slowly, and I felt nothing. For the first time in 7 years, I heard him blame me for existing, and I felt absolutely nothing. That's not nothing, Alexander said. That's freedom. It just doesn't announce itself the way people expect. It doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like quiet. Emma looked at him for a moment. You've done this, she said. Walked out of something that had its hooks in you. You keep knowing exactly what it feels like. Alexander was quiet for a beat. My father, he said finally. I told you a little. The night I took the company back, he called me much like Ryan just called you, and he told me I was ungrateful, that I'd never have amounted to anything without him, that everything I had I owed to him. He looked out toward the window, and I stood there waiting to feel guilty, because I'd felt guilty my whole life around him, and nothing came, just quiet. That's how I knew I was finally out. He turned back to her. You're out, Emma. Welcome to the quiet. It gets loud again eventually in a good way, but for now, let yourself have the quiet. Meanwhile, the Carter family was learning what happens when the foundation walks away. Victoria Carter had spent decades building a position in society on the strength of her son's rising star and her family's careful image. In 72 hours, both were gone. The invitations stopped coming. The friends who had pinned heirlooms and toasted futures were suddenly mysteriously always busy. Because that was how Victoria's world worked. It had always worked that way. She'd simply never been on this side of it. And Victoria, who had been so quick to promise she would bury Emma, found that she could barely leave her own house without feeling 300 witnesses in every glance. And Daniel, the younger brother, the man the entire trust had been built to enrich the man who was supposed to be taken care of. Daniel discovered that there was nothing to take care of him with. The trust was empty. It had been built to fill with Emma's assets, and Emma's assets had never come. Daniel, who had spent 34 years assuming that someone eventually would hand him a comfortable life, found himself for the first time facing the possibility that no one was coming to do that. He called Ryan furious, demanding to know where his money was, and the two brothers had a screaming argument in the ruins of their mother's living room, each blaming the other. neither of them capable of blaming themselves, and Victoria sat between them and understood with a clarity that came far too late that she had raised two sons who knew how to take and had never once learned how to build. But the story was not finished twisting even now, because 8 days after the wedding, Emma received a phone call that she had not expected, and it changed the texture of everything. It was from a woman named Sarah Chen, a name Emma didn't recognize at first until the woman explained. Sarah had been engaged to Ryan Carter 9 years ago, before Emma. "I saw the video," Sarah said, her voice careful testing. "The one from the wedding, and I saw the trust on the screen. And I need to tell you something because I've carried it for 9 years and I never had proof, and now I think maybe you're the one person in the world who'll believe me." She took a breath. "He did it to me too. Not exactly the same, but the same shape. He got engaged to me. He moved all his failing debts into a structure with my name on it, and 3 weeks before our wedding, he broke it off in a way that left me holding everything. I lost my house. I lost my savings. I lost years. And everyone told me I was crazy, that Ryan was a good guy, that I must have done something. I've spent 9 years thinking maybe I did." Her voice cracked. "And then I saw your video, and I saw the exact same trust structure, and I realized I wasn't crazy. He'd done it before. He'd probably do it again. I needed you to know that what you did in that room, you didn't just do it for you did it for me too. 9 years too late, but you did it." Emma sat with the phone against her ear, and something moved through her that was larger than anything she'd felt in that ballroom. Because this was the twist, she hadn't seen the one that reframed the whole story. She had thought she was the target, the one Ryan chose to use. But she wasn't the first. She was the second, at least maybe not even that. Ryan Carter wasn't a man who'd made one terrible choice under pressure. He was a pattern, a machine that ran the same con on a new woman every few years. And the only thing that made Emma different from Sarah Chen was that Emma had happened to see the photograph in time and had happened to be exactly calculating enough to do something about it. "Sarah," Emma said quietly, "thank you for telling me. And I need you to hear something because you've carried the wrong thing for 9 years. You weren't crazy. You didn't do anything. You loved someone who was designed to take advantage of exactly that love. That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw in him, and now it's on record, and you never have to wonder again." She paused. "And Sarah, would you be willing to talk to a lawyer, not to relive it? But because I think there may be others, and I think the only way this ever really ends is if the women he did this to stop being alone in it." There was a long silence, and then Sarah Chen said in a voice that had steadied into something Emma recognized the voice of a woman finding her feet, "Yes, God, yes. I've waited 9 years to not be alone in it." Emma hung up and looked at Alexander, who had heard the whole thing. "There are others," she said. "There are always others," Alexander said grimly. "Men like Ryan don't do it once. The wedding you blew up wasn't the crime. It was just the one you got to watch." He studied her face. "What do you want to do?" Emma thought about it. She thought about Sarah Chen carrying 9 years of unearned shame. She thought about the next woman, whoever she would have been, the one Ryan would have found in a year or two after the dust settled, after he'd rebuilt just enough charm to seem safe again. She thought about Lily, 24 years old, nearly used up as a prop before she'd even understood what was happening to her. "I don't want revenge," Emma said slowly. "I've never wanted revenge, but I want it to be over, really over, not just for me. I want it so that there's no next woman, and the only way to do that is to make sure the pattern is documented and public and permanent." She looked at Alexander. "Can you help me find the others quietly? Not to attack him, just to give them what Sarah just got, the proof that they weren't crazy, and each other so they're not alone." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that went beyond respect, now something warmer and more complicated that neither of them was ready to name. "You know what the difference is between you and every other person who's ever walked into my office wanting to take someone down," he said. "They wanted to win. You want it to be over. Those are completely different things, and almost nobody understands that." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll help you find them. All of them. And Emma," he paused, When this is done, and I mean really done, I want to talk to you about something. Not business, but it can wait. It's waited this long." Emma held his gaze, and she felt something flutter that she quickly carefully set aside because she was not ready, because it was too soon, because she had spent 7 years learning the hard way what happens when you build your life around a man. "It can wait," she agreed softly. "Let's finish this first." Over the next several weeks, quietly and without fanfare, Alexander's people and Emma's instincts assembled a picture that was even worse than either of them had feared. There had been 4 women, 4 across 12 years. Sarah Chen first, then a woman named Patricia, then someone Ryan had never even formalized an engagement with but had still managed to drain financially. Then Emma, each one successful, each one generous, each one exactly the kind of woman whose competence made her feel obligated to save the man she loved right up until he took everything and blamed her for making him do it. The trust structure Victoria had built for Emma was not a one-time scheme. It was the family business. Victoria had been refining it for over a decade, adjusting it, improving it, and each time the last woman had been too ashamed and too isolated to fight back. Emma brought all 4 women together. Not for a lawsuit at first, though the lawyers would come. She brought them together in a room, the 4 of them and herself, 5 women who had loved the same man and been used by the same machine, and she watched them realize one by one that they had never been alone. She watched 9 years of shame lift off Sarah Chen's shoulders. She watched Patricia, who had blamed herself for a decade, put her hands over her face and cry with something that was almost relief. And Emma understood, sitting in that room, that this was the real thing she had done. Not the screens, not the humiliation, not even her own freedom. This, 5 women who would never again wonder if they deserved it. "He counted on us being ashamed," Sarah said to the room. "That was the whole thing. He counted on us being too embarrassed to ever talk to each other. Because if we ever talked, we'd see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, the shame goes to where it belongs." "To him," Patricia said. "To him," Emma agreed. The legal consequences, when they came, were not something Emma had to engineer. She had never needed to. That was the beauty of the truth. Once it was out, it moved on its own. Gerald Hartwell's legal team pursued the fraud claims. The 4 women's collective testimony, carefully documented, painted a picture of a decade-long pattern that no charm could survive. Ryan Carter was not going to prison for loving the wrong way. You can't be imprisoned for that. But you can be held to account for fraud, for financial deception, for the fabricated numbers he'd handed to investors, and the walls closed in on him, one legal filing at a time. His assets, what remained of them, went to settlements. His career was not damaged, but ended. The rising star of Wall Street became a cautionary tale that people told at dinner parties, a name that made investors check their exits. And Victoria Carter, who had built the machine, who had refined it across 4 women in 12 years, who had pinned an heirloom on Emma's collar and called her daughter, found that the machine had a final, unexpected feature. When it broke on her too. Her name was on the trust structures, all of them. Her fingerprints legally were everywhere. She had been so careful to keep her son's hands clean that she had put everything under her own control, and when the truth came out, there was no one left for her to hide behind. The woman who had promised to bury Emma spent the following year with lawyers of her own, watching the society she'd built her life around close its doors one by one. Emma took no joy in it. That was the thing that people who heard the story later always found hard to believe. But it was true. She didn't celebrate Victoria's downfall or Ryan's or Daniel's. She had said it herself weeks ago in that first cold, clear night. She wasn't going to burn his house down. She was just going to stop being the foundation it stood on. And that was exactly what had happened. She had removed herself, and everything that had only ever been standing on her had fallen on its own, under its own weight. She hadn't destroyed the Carters. She'd simply stopped saving them, and it turned out that without someone to save them, they'd been falling the whole time. There was one more conversation, though, that Emma had not planned for. It was Lily. 3 weeks after the wedding, Lily Parker came to see her, and this time there were no tears, no trembling. This was a different Lily, steadier, older somehow in a way that had nothing to do with weeks. She sat down across from Emma and said, I quit the firm, obviously, but I wanted to ask you something, and it's okay if the answer is no. She took a breath. That thing you said at my desk weeks ago about how you'd make sure I landed somewhere better, did you mean it, or was that just something to say to get me to help you? And Emma looked at this young woman who had stood up in a room full of powerful strangers and told the truth at the cost of her whole career, and she felt something almost maternal, almost fierce. "Lily," she said, "I don't say things to get people to do what I want. That was Ryan. That's the whole difference between him and me, and I need you to learn it because you're 24 and you have a long life ahead of you, and you need to know which kind of person to become. When I said I'd make sure you landed somewhere better, I meant it as a promise, and I keep my promises." She slid a card across the table. "I'm building something new, my own firm with real partners, real integrity, none of the rot. I want you in it, not as charity and not because I feel sorry for you. Because you showed me in that room that you have the one thing you can't teach, the willingness to tell the truth when it costs you everything. I can teach you finance. I can't teach that. You already have it." Lily stared at the card. Then she looked up and her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry, and Emma was proud of her for that. "Why are you being kind to me?" Lily asked. "I was the woman in the photo. I was the reason I was part of the thing that hurt you." "You were a knife in someone else's hand," Emma said gently. "That's not the same as being the hand. And the second you understood what you were being used for, you put yourself down. You refused to be a weapon. Do you have any idea how rare that is, Lily? How many people just keep being the knife because it's easier?" She shook her head. "No, you don't get to carry that. That belongs to Ryan. You carry the other thing, the part where you stood up. Carry that instead." Lily picked up the card, and she made Emma a promise of her own in a steady voice. "I'm going to be the kind of person you are," she said. "Not the kind of person he is. I decided that in the car actually weeks ago when I woke up and saw him watching me and felt sick. I just didn't know how yet." She held up the card. "Now I know how." 6 weeks after the wedding that was never his, Emma Whitmore stood in the empty offices of what would become her new firm, a space Alexander had helped her secure, though the vision was entirely her own. The rooms were bare, waiting to be filled, and Emma stood in the center of them and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, maybe ever. She felt like the ground under her feet was hers, not shared, not borrowed, not standing on anyone and no one standing on her, just hers. Alexander found her there. He'd taken to finding her in these weeks in a way that had stopped feeling like business a while ago, though neither of them had said so. "It suits you," he said, looking around at the empty rooms. "The emptiness, not because it's empty, because everything that fills it is going to be yours." He looked at her. "You did it, Emma. Do you feel it yet? That it's really over?" Emma turned to him, and she thought about the woman she'd been 6 weeks ago, standing at that restaurant window watching her whole life dissolve on a phone screen, smiling because she'd finally understood something painful. She thought about how far that woman had come, how the thing that had looked in that first terrible moment like the end of everything had actually been the first day of a life that was finally entirely her own. "I feel it," she said, and then more quietly looking at him, "You said weeks ago that when this was really done you wanted to talk to me about something, not business." Alexander went still. "I did say that." "It's done, Alexander," Emma said. "It's really done." And she looked at him, this man who had never once asked her to be smaller, who had partnered with her instead of using her, who had stood beside her in that ballroom and offered his arm not to lead, but to accompany. "So talk to me." And in the empty offices of the life Emma Whitmore had built entirely for herself, with the late light coming through the windows and the whole vast future stretching out ahead of her, Alexander Reed took a breath and finally, for the first time, began to say the thing he'd been carrying since the night she called him at 3 a.m. and changed both their lives forever. "I've never done this before," Alexander said, and Emma almost laughed because in the weeks she'd known him, she had never once seen this composed, formidable man look unsure of anything. "I've made a career out of knowing exactly what to say, and right now I have no idea. So I'm just going to say the true thing, which is the one thing I never learned how to make sound polished." "Then say the true thing," Emma said quietly. He looked at her across the empty office. When you called me at 3 in the morning, I told you it was the best business deal I'd been offered in years. That was true, but it stopped being about business somewhere around the second week, and I didn't tell you because you were fighting for your life, and the last thing you needed was a man complicating it. You just escaped one man who wanted something from you. I wasn't going to become another. He took a breath. But it's done now. You're free. You don't need me for anything anymore, and that's exactly why I can finally say this without it being a cage. I'm not offering you a rescue, Emma. You already rescued yourself. I'm asking if there might be room someday when you're ready for something real, and if the answer is no, or not now, or not ever, I will still be your partner, and I will still be proud of you, and nothing changes. That's the whole thing. That's the true thing. Emma was quiet for a long moment. And here was the twist that even she had not expected in herself, because 6 weeks ago, she would have said no immediately, would have run from anything that looked like the beginning of another entanglement. But she had learned something in those 6 weeks that changed the shape of the question entirely. She had learned the difference between a man who wanted her to be smaller and a man who wanted her exactly as she was. And she realized standing in that empty office that her fear wasn't really about Alexander at all. Her fear was that she'd repeat the past. And the way you don't repeat the past isn't by refusing to love again, it's by refusing to shrink again. I need to tell you something, Emma said slowly, and I need you to hear all of it before you answer the way you made me hear all of your proposal weeks ago. She stepped closer. I am never going to be smaller than I am. Not for you, not for anyone, ever again. I spent 7 years making myself smaller so a man could feel big, and it nearly cost me everything. So if there's ever going to be a someday between us, it has to be built on the thing you said that very first night, that the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. You can never ever be the person who underestimates me. The day you need me to be less so you can feel like more, that's the day it ends. Do you understand, Emma? Alexander said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice. That's not a condition. That's the entire reason I'm asking. I don't want a woman who makes me feel big. I have spent my whole life around people who made themselves small around powerful men, and it made me sick because I watched it kill my mother. I don't want small. I want you at full height standing next to me so that when I look over, I'm looking at an equal and not down at someone I've diminished. He paused. The day I need you to be less is the day I've become my father, and I'd rather lose you than become him, so hold me to it. Please, be the person who holds me to it. And Emma Whitmore, who had learned the hard way to read what was underneath a man's words, listened for the hook, the catch, the quiet condition hiding beneath the beautiful sentence. And for the first time in 7 years, she didn't find one. Then someday, she said softly. Not today, not next month, but someday when I've stood on my own ground long enough to know it's really mine someday, yes, we can talk about something real. Alexander smiled, and it was not the smile of a man who'd won something. It was the smile of a man who was simply glad. Someday, he agreed. I've waited this long. I can wait for someday. The months that followed were the fullest of Emma Whitmore's life. She built her firm from those empty rooms into something that the industry had never quite seen before. She hired differently. She hired the people others overlooked, the brilliant women who'd been talked over in meetings, the honest analysts who'd been passed up for the charming ones, the young people like Lily who had integrity but no pedigree. She built a company on the radical premise that competence and character were worth more than charm, and within a year, the results silenced everyone who'd whispered that Emma Whitmore was only ever successful because she'd been standing behind Ryan Carter. Because now there was no one behind and no one in front. There was only Emma at full height, and the numbers she produced were undeniable. Gerald Hartwell was her first major investor exactly as he'd promised in the ballroom. He sat in her new office 3 weeks after the wedding and looked around and said, I spent 2 years thinking I was investing in Ryan Carter. I was investing in you the whole time. I just had the name wrong on the check. And he wrote her a new check with the right name on it, and it was the beginning of everything. Lily Parker flourished. The frightened young woman who had once fallen asleep in the wrong man's car became, under Emma's mentorship, one of the sharpest young analysts in the firm. But more than that, She became proof of something Emma believed in her bones, that a person is not defined by the worst thing that happened to them or by the way someone else tried to use them, but by what they choose to become afterward. Lily chose to become someone with a spine, and every time Emma watched her stand up in a meeting and say the hard, true thing that no one else would say, she remembered a 24-year-old girl crying in a ballroom, finding her feet, and she thought, that's what I built. Not the company. Her. The four women, Sarah, Patricia, and the others, did not fade back into their separate lives after the legal filings were done. They stayed connected, the five of them bound by the strange sisterhood of having survived the same machine. They started meeting once a month at first, then more, and what began as a support group slowly became something larger. Sarah Chen, who had carried 9 years of unearned shame, became the loudest voice among them, and she said to Emma one evening, "You know what he did without meaning to. Ryan Carter spent 12 years trying to isolate women so we couldn't compare notes, and he ended up creating the exact opposite. He built us a sisterhood. 5 women who will never be alone again, and who will make damn sure the next woman he'd have targeted never exists." She raised her glass. "To the worst matchmaker in America." And they laughed, all 5 of them, the deep, clean laugh of people who have come out the other side of something and found each other waiting there. As for Ryan Carter, the man who had believed his wedding would be his coronation, Emma heard about him only occasionally, and she found each time that she felt less and less. The fraud settlements took what remained of his fortune. His name became unusable in the only industry he'd ever known. He tried once, about 8 months later, to reach out to her again, a long email, self-pitying and manipulative, by turns blaming her, then begging her, then blaming her again, circling the same drain he'd been circling in that final phone call. Emma read the first paragraph, recognized the pattern, and deleted it without finishing. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The most complete revenge she had learned was not a reply. It was the silence of a woman who had genuinely stopped thinking about you. Victoria Carter's fall was the slowest and, in its way, the most complete. The society that had been her entire identity did not forgive her, because society never forgives the people it once envied for finally giving it a reason. She kept a lawyer on retainer to the end, not the private investigator she'd once used to circle Emma, but a defense attorney, and she spent her final years as a cautionary whisper at the parties she was no longer invited to. She had promised to bury Emma. Instead, she had built brick by careful brick over 12 years, the machine that buried her own family. Emma never spoke to her again, and never needed to. She had said everything she needed to say in the hallway before the ceremony, and the years had simply proven her right. And Daniel, the brother, the whole scheme had been built to enrich, got a job. It was in the end the most fitting outcome of all. With no trust to live off, no family fortune to shelter him, no successful woman being funneled toward his bank account, Daniel Carter had to do the one thing he'd spent 34 years avoiding. He had to build something himself. Emma heard years later that he'd become a moderately successful salesman somewhere and had apparently finally grown up. She found she was almost glad about it, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because it confirmed the deepest thing she believed, that the kindest thing you can do for a person who has never had to stand on their own is to stop being the ground beneath them. She hadn't punished Daniel, she'd freed him too, though he'd never know it. A little over a year after the wedding that was never his, on an evening when the city lights were coming up in the windows, Emma stood in the penthouse she now shared with Alexander Reed. They had married quietly months earlier. A real marriage this time chosen and not arranged, though Emma still smiled at the irony that the arrangement had come first and the love had grown up inside it. There had been no giant screens, no 300 witnesses, no coronation, just the two of them and the handful of people who mattered, including Lily and Sarah and the sisterhood, and it had been the most honest room Emma had ever stood in. Alexander came to stand beside her at the window, beside her, never behind, never in front, beside always the way he'd promised in the empty office a year and a lifetime ago. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, not the way Ryan used to say it, noticing her mood, the way you'd notice a thermostat. Alexander said it the way you ask about someone you actually see. "Where'd you go in your head?" Emma watched the lights come up across the city. "I was thinking about the woman I was," she said. Standing at that restaurant window watching my whole life fall apart on a phone screen, 30 days before the wedding, I remember thinking it was the worst moment of my life. She turned to him, and it was in a way, but it was also the first honest moment I'd had in 7 years. The moment I finally saw the truth. Everything good in my life, now this firm, these women who aren't alone anymore. Lily, you, all of it grew out of the worst moment of my life. Alexander was quiet for a moment. And then he asked the question he'd been circling all evening. She could tell the question that had made him watch her a little more carefully than usual. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Changing grooms, everything you had to burn to get here." And Emma smiled, because it was the simplest question in the world, and she'd known the answer for a long time now, maybe since that very first cold, clear night at her kitchen table. "I didn't change grooms, Alexander," she said. "That's what everyone thinks the story is. The woman who swapped one man for a better one at the altar. But that was never it." She looked out at the city she'd built her real life in. "I didn't change my groom. I changed my life. Ryan was never the point. Getting even was never the point. You, as wonderful as you are, were never even the point. The point was that I spent 7 years believing my worth was measured by what I could give a man who wanted me small. And the day I saw that photograph, I finally understood the truth that had been waiting for me my whole life." She turned to face him fully. "Sometimes losing the wrong person is the first step toward finding yourself." Alexander reached out and took her hand. "And did you?" he asked softly. "Find yourself?" Emma thought about the empty offices that were now full of people who told the truth. She thought about Lily standing up in that ballroom. She thought about 5 women who would never again wonder if they were crazy, if they deserved it, if it was their fault. She thought about the woman at the restaurant window who had smiled instead of screamed because, even then, before she'd understood any of it, some deep part of her had already known that a door was opening, even as another one closed. "I did," she said. It turned out she was never lost. She was just buried under 7 years of being told to make herself small. All I had to do was stop apologizing for taking up space, and there she was. She'd been there the whole time, waiting for me to stop being afraid of her. And that was the truth at the center of the whole story. The thing Ryan Carter had never understood, the thing Victoria had never understood, the thing that all their scheming had been designed to keep Emma from ever discovering. They had counted on her staying small. They had built an entire machine on the assumption that a woman, that competent, that generous, that loyal, would never wake up to her own worth. And they had been right for 7 years, right up until the night a single photograph appeared on a screen and Emma Whitmore looked at it, and instead of breaking, she finally saw clearly, and instead of screaming, she smiled. Because in that smile was the beginning of everything. In that smile was a woman who had just decided, though she didn't fully know it yet, that she would never again be the foundation someone else stood on while calling her too much. In that smile was the frozen accounts and the canceled venue, and the file built clean and undeniable. In that smile was the 3 a.m. phone call, and the empty offices, and the sisterhood, and Lily's brave, shaking voice, and the giant screens, and the man who offered his arm to stand beside her and not to lead. In that one small, calm, private smile at a restaurant window 30 days before a wedding that would never happen was the whole rest of Emma Whitmore's life. She had walked into that evening as a woman about to lose everything. She had walked out of it as a woman who was finally, for the first time, about to become everything she was. The people who tried to keep her small became a cautionary tale. The woman they underestimated became one of the most respected leaders in her industry, the founder of a firm built on truth, the protector of the women who came after her, and the wife of a man who loved her at full height and would have lost her before he ever asked her to shrink. And somewhere out there, the next woman, Ryan Carter, would have targeted the one who never had to lose her house or her savings, or 9 years of her life to shame went on living a life she never knew had been quietly saved by a bride who chose herself in a ballroom full of witnesses. Ryan Carter had once posted 9 words that he thought were the cruelest thing he could say. "I can't be with her, but I'll always protect the woman I truly love." He'd meant them to wound, and in the end they became the truest words he ever spoke, just not the way he intended. Because there was a woman who got protected in this story. There was a woman who got truly loved, who found her worth, who built an empire and a sisterhood and a real marriage and a life entirely her own. It just turned out to be the woman he threw away. Emma Whitmore didn't get revenge on the people who tried to destroy her. She did something far more permanent and far more devastating and far more free. She became someone they could never reach again. And she never once looked back because everything worth seeing was finally, at long last, right in front of her. That is the whole truth of it. Emma Whitmore lost the wrong man, and in losing him, she found herself, and no one ever again would convince her to be anything less than all the way fully, unapologetically her. That is where her story ends, and where her real life, the one that was always meant to be hers, finally and completely begins. 5 years after the wedding that was never his, Emma Whitmore Reed stood at the back of a crowded auditorium and watched a 19-year-old girl walk onto a stage, and she felt her whole chest go tight with something she didn't have a good word for. The girl's name was Maria. She was the first graduate of a program Emma had started 3 years earlier, almost by accident, out of a conversation with Sarah Chen that had gone late into the night. They'd been talking the way they still did about the machine that had used them, and Sarah had said the thing that changed everything. The reason it worked on all of us, she'd said, wasn't that we were stupid. It was that no one ever taught us our own worth in numbers. We knew how to love. We never learned how to protect ourselves while we did it. Nobody teaches young women the financial part, the part where you keep your own name on your own accounts, the part where love and self-protection aren't enemies. Emma had sat with that for a week, and then she'd built a program. It taught young women, the ones from nowhere, the ones with no family money and no safety net, the exact kind of women Ryan Carter would have circled like a shark, how to build and protect their own financial lives, how to read a contract, how to never sign the thing they didn't understand, how to love someone with their whole heart and still keep their own name on the deed. And now Maria, 19 years old from a neighborhood where nobody expected her to become anything, was walking across a stage to accept a full position at Emma's firm, and she was going to be the first of hundreds. "You did this," Alexander murmured beside her. He'd come, of course. He came to all of them. "You know that, right? This whole room exists because of a photograph you saw 5 years ago." "No," Emma said quietly, watching Maria shake hands and beam out at the crowd. "This room exists because I stopped being ashamed of the photograph. There's a difference," she smiled. "Being hurt didn't build anything. Refusing to stay small did." After the ceremony, Maria found Emma in the crowd, and the girl was trembling the way Lily had once trembled all those years ago, and she said, "Mrs. Reed, I have to tell you something. I almost didn't apply. My boyfriend told me the program was stupid. He said I didn't need to learn about money, that he'd take care of all that I should focus on us." Her voice caught. "And I almost listened. I almost didn't come, and then I read the story, your story, the one everybody knows, and I thought if she'd listened to the man who told her to be smaller, none of this would exist. So I broke up with him, and I applied, and here I am." She wiped her eyes. "I just needed you to know that. Your story made me not listen to a man who was trying to shrink me. Before I even knew I was worth more." Emma stood very still, because this was the thing she could never have planned, the twist she never saw coming, even after all these years. She had spent so long thinking of her story as something that happened to her, a wound she'd survived. And here was a 19-year-old girl telling her that the wound had become a map, that other women were using Emma's worst moment to find their way out of their own before it ever got as bad as hers. "Maria," Emma said, and she took the girl's hands the way she'd once taken Lily's. "Listen to me, because this is the most important thing I'll ever tell you. You didn't break up with him because of my story. My story just gave you permission to hear something you already knew. You were always worth more. Every woman who ever gets talked into being small already knows somewhere deep down that she's being asked to bury something precious. The story doesn't teach you your worth. It just reminds you that you were never supposed to hide it." She squeezed the girl's hands. "Now go be enormous. That's an order." Maria laughed through her tears and promised she would. Later that evening, the whole strange, beautiful family gathered, because that was what they'd become over 5 years, a family stitched together out of survival. Sarah Chen was there running the program's outreach, now unrecognizable from the woman who'd carried 9 years of shame. Patricia had become a financial counselor, specializing in helping women untangle themselves from predatory relationships, turning her worst decade into her life's work. And Lily Parker. Lily, who had once been a frightened prop in someone else's cruelty, Lily was now a senior partner at the firm, 29 years old, and formidable, sitting at Emma's right hand in every major decision. "I want to make a toast," Lily said, standing, raising her glass, and the room quieted. "5 years ago, I was asleep in the wrong man's car, and I woke up as a photograph designed to hurt the best woman I've ever known." Her voice was steady now, no trembling left in it at all. And that woman, instead of hating me, saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. She told me I could be the kind of person who tells the truth even when it costs everything. And I believed her because she was living proof it was possible. She looked at Emma. So here's to Emma. Not because she survived, lots of people survive, but because she took the thing meant to destroy her and turned it into a door that 1,000 women have now walked through. That's not survival, that's alchemy. The room raised their glasses, and Emma felt her eyes sting, and Alexander's hand found hers under the table. But the evening held one more twist, one Emma truly did not see coming. A woman approached their table near the end of the night, hesitant, older, well-dressed, but somehow diminished, and it took Emma a moment to recognize her, and when she did, the whole table went silent. It was Victoria Carter. 5 years had not been kind to her. The society armor was gone. She stood there smaller than Emma had ever seen her, and for a long, tense moment, nobody at the table breathed, because Sarah and Patricia and Lily all knew exactly who she was, all knew she was the architect of the machine that had used them. "I'm not going to stay," Victoria said, and her voice had lost its poise and worn down to something almost human. "I know I'm not welcome. I read about the program, in the paper, about what you're building for those girls." She looked at Emma, and something moved across her face that Emma had never seen there before in all their years of dinners and pinned heirlooms and cold, poisonous smiles. "I spent my whole life teaching my sons to take, and I watched them lose everything because taking was all they knew how to do. And I've had 5 years to sit with the fact that the one person I tried hardest to destroy is the one person who's out there teaching young women not to become what I made my sons." She swallowed. "I don't want anything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say once out loud to your face you were right. In that hallway, you told me I'd built the machine that would bury my own family. And I have lived every day since inside the truth of that." Her voice broke just slightly. "You were the best thing that ever came near my family, and we were too small to see it. That's all. That's all I came to say." And then something happened that surprised everyone at the table, including Emma herself. Emma stood up, and she looked at this broken old woman who had once promised to bury her, and she did not gloat, and she did not forgive exactly, because some things aren't hers to forgive on behalf of the women Victoria had helped harm. But she did something harder and more complete. She said gently, "Victoria, sit down for a moment, not as family, not as enemies, just as two women who both know exactly how much damage a machine like that can do." She gestured to an empty chair. "You want to make it right? There's no making it right, but there's a program full of 19-year-old girls who need people to teach them what the machine looks like from the inside. Nobody knows how to build one better than you. Nobody knows the warning signs better than the person who designed them." She held Victoria's gaze. "Turn it into something. That's the only real apology there is, not the words, the turning." Victoria stared at her stunned tears, streaking a face that had once been so carefully controlled. "You'd let me, after everything." "I'm not letting you do anything," Emma said. "I'm telling you that your only path to living with yourself runs through those girls. What you do with that is up to you. It always was." She sat back down. "The offer's real. Think about it." Victoria left without answering, but 3 weeks later she called the program's office and she asked in a small voice if the offer had been serious. And it had been. And Victoria Carter spent the last years of her life standing in front of rooms of young women describing the exact anatomy of the trap she'd built 4 times, teaching them to see it coming a mile away, turning the darkest expertise imaginable into a warning that saved girls she'd never meet. It didn't undo what she'd done. Nothing could. But it was in the end the only redemption available to her, and Emma had handed it to her, not out of softness, but out of the deepest strength of all the refusal to let even her worst enemy stay useless. That night in the penthouse, Alexander watched Emma stand at the window, the way she had 5 years earlier, the city lights coming up below. "I have to ask," he said. "Victoria, after everything she did, why?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Because the whole point," she said, "was never to destroy people. I told you that the very first night, and I meant it. Ryan, Victoria, Daniel. I never wanted them to fall. I just wanted to stop holding them up. And the thing is, once you truly stop needing someone to fall, you stop being tied to them at all. I wasn't being generous to Victoria. I stopped caring about her enough to want her punished a long time ago. All I care about now is the girls. And if the woman who built the trap can help me teach them to avoid it, then she's finally for once in her life useful. That's not forgiveness. That's just refusing to waste anything. Not even her." Alexander shook his head slowly with the same wonder he'd felt the very first time she'd walked into his office. "You know," he said, "5 years ago I told you the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. I was talking about power. I thought I understood what I meant." He looked at her. "I was wrong. It's not about power at all. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who's so completely free that they can't be controlled by anyone, not by love, not by hate, not by revenge, not even by the desire to see the guilty punished. You can't manipulate a person who wants nothing from anyone. You're the freest person I've ever met, Emma, and that's the most powerful thing there is." Emma turned from the window and smiled at him. The man who had never once asked her to be smaller, who had spent 5 years standing beside her, and never in front, who had loved her at full height and never flinched from any inch of it. "I wasn't always free," she said. "There was a woman at a restaurant window 5 years ago who thought her whole life was ending. She was so afraid. She'd been small for so long she didn't even know there was another way to be." She crossed the room and took his hands. "I think about her sometimes. That frightened woman who smiled instead of screaming. And I want to go back and tell her the thing I know now. That the moment she thought was the end was actually the door. That everything she was afraid of losing was worth losing. That the man walking away from her was doing her the greatest favor of her life, though it would take her a while to understand it." Emma's voice grew quiet, certain complete. That she was never going to lose herself. She was going to find herself. And 1,000 other women were going to find themselves too, because she was brave enough to stop being small. Outside the window, the city glittered, the same city where a photograph had once destroyed a 7-year love story, the same city where a woman had walked into a ballroom and taken her whole life back, the same city that had watched the underestimated become undeniable. And Emma Whitmore, Reed, the woman who chose herself, stood in the center of the life she had built entirely on her own terms. The firm, the program, the sisterhood, the marriage of equals, the 1,000 young women learning they were worth more than anyone had ever told them, and she knew with a certainty that no one would ever take from her again that the smile she'd smiled at that restaurant window 5 years ago had been the truest thing she'd ever done. Because it wasn't the smile of a woman who'd lost everything. It was the smile of a woman who was about to become everything she was always meant to be. And she did. Every single day she did, and she would for the rest of her life, and so would every woman who ever heard her story and decided because of it to never again make herself small for anyone. That is the ending. Not a wedding, not a revenge, something better and more permanent than either. A woman who lost the wrong person, found herself, and then spent the rest of her life making sure other women could find themselves too. Emma Whitmore chose herself in a room full of witnesses, and in choosing herself, she taught 1,000 others to do the same. That is a victory no one can ever take away, and that is exactly how her story was always meant to end.